A very good Tuesday afternoon to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for joining us today as we continue our walk through history, considering the story of the Bible and what it teaches us about our God, who he is, what he has done, and what he expects of us. Unfortunately, we are in a section of scripture, not unfortunately, but we're in an unfortunate portion of scripture where the people that are involved don't seem to care as much about that as they ought to have. We're in the Judges. We are specifically today in Judges chapter 11, which contains the very unfortunate, again, story of Jepthah. Lots to get into today. Looking forward to doing that with you and doing it with my co-host, who is with us as always, Alan Seenestrang. Alan, it is good to see you today. Hope you're doing well. Let's get into a very interesting, we'll use that word for the moment, interesting story of Jepthah.
Very controversial.
To say the least, to say the least, for sure. Yeah, to get into Jepthah, we'll take just a quick back step into chapter 10 to look at where we've been within Judges. There's three particular visuals that we've really looked at to help us understand what's going on within the Judges. The first one being the basis for the Judges, the cycle of sin, where there is a faithfulness to Yahweh that's exhibited by the people. They then cheat on the Lord in a sense. They commit spiritual adultery by going after the gods of the people around them. God punishes them and seeks to chastise them through allowing others to oppress and afflict pain upon them in various ways. The people of God would cry out to the Lord. He would raise up a judge, and that judge would restore peace and allow for the people to be faithful once again before that cycle just starts all over again. We've seen this a number of times throughout Judges up to this point, but here in chapter 10, this idolatry and spiritual adultery that is exhibited by the people just gets to a whole new height, and where there are 7 idols that are mentioned beginning in Judges chapter 6, that you have the Baals and the Ashereths, you have the gods of Aram and Sidon and Moab, you have the gods of the Ammonites and the Philistines, that they abandoned the Lord, the text says, and they did not worship him. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, excuse me, and he sold them to the Philistines and the Ammonites, and they oppressed them, just like we're seeing in this cycle. And yet at this point, whenever they cry out to God, God isn't buying it, because he, of course, is omnipotent in every respect. But he wants them to understand that he sees exactly what they're doing. They're doing nothing but trying to manipulate God, have their cake and eat it too, that they want to have the blessings of God while also participating in the paganism of the people around them. So they really reached a new low as far as the spiritual circumstances and spiritual health within Israel. And that corresponds very well with what we see in this other visual that we have on the screen, which is the downward spiral or cycle of the Judges. Philip Martin, as he refers to it, the fatal funnel. And then that also corresponds with the cycle of the Judges and how they parallel with one another, as you see in Kenneth Way's depiction of such on the right side of the screen there. Alan, we're down towards the bottom now. We've worked our way from a few guys that seem to have been decently positive in their storylines, with Othniel and Ehud and Shamgar. Deborah and Barak have some good high points. Gideon has a couple of high points, but then once we get past Gideon, we just start going downhill in finishing out his story. Abimelech was just a disaster. Tola and Jair just don't give us all too much, though they might give us a few hints towards these judges trying to morph themselves into something more than judges, maybe elevate themselves as kings. And then we get to Jepthah here in chapter 11. His story continues on a little bit into chapter 12. We'll handle that on Friday. But then Ibzan and Elon and Abdon are mentioned. Again, not much told about them. But here with Jepthah, we really see a very negative transformation taking place with these people who we would see as judges, being the key characters within this particular writing. And if we continue on through to in chapter 10 towards the end, we see the transition into the story of Jepthah, and I'll let you throw the text there on the screen, Alan, where we are told at the end of chapter 10, verse 17, that the Ammonites were called together and they camped in Gilead. So the Israelites assembled and camped in Mizpah, and the rulers of Gilead said to one another, "Which man will begin the fight against the Ammonites? He will be the leader of all the inhabitants of Gilead, which leads us straight into what we see at the beginning of chapter 11 with Jepthah, that he is a Gileadite and he was a valiant warrior. We've seen this before, Alan, this language valiant warrior about Gideon. There we see that a little bit tongue in cheek, but here this seems to be very legitimate that he is a valiant warrior. The unfortunate thing is that he was the son of a prostitute, however, and Gilead was his father. Verse 2 says that Gilead's wife bore him sons, and when they grew up, they drove Jepthah out and said to him, "You will have no inheritance in my father's family because you are the son of another woman." So Jepthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. And then some worthless men joined Jepthah and went on raids with him. We're introduced to this man, Alan, and he is precipitated by the fact that there is oppression at the hands of the Ammonites. And yet, whenever we just see what is told to us in these 3 verses in chapter 11, the picture painted for who Jepthah is in his home life just really is not good at all, and might give us a little insight into the overall situation that we find here within Israel, that there is not a strong faithfulness to God, but that this that is spoken of here, this prostitute being involved, brings to mind the prostitution of the people in regards to their faith. It lets us know exactly what's going on in Israel at this time, and it just isn't good at all, Alan.
Yeah, and you get a sense of it here right at the end of chapter 10. I mean, it seemed like Israel's maybe turning back a little bit. They're crying out to God specifically, but God reminds them, you've been worshiping all these. I mean, he lists in verse 11, the gods of the Egyptians and Amorites and Ammonites and Philistines and Sidonians and Amalekites and Man. I mean, he lists all these different gods and different countries' gods that they've worshipped, and kind of, he says, go cry out to them. And then you kind of get down here, there's this issue with the Ammonites. Well, what do they do in verse 18? Are they calling to God again? Hey, God, who will deliver us from this? No, they just say, hey, who will fight for us? He will be the leader of all of Gilead. So there's, they've just like, well, God's not going to help us. Let's move on to someone else. And really, it doesn't seem like anyone really steps up, because you're introduced to Jepthah and you're kind of given his history. He's the son of a prostitute. He's been thrown out of his house. He's no longer welcome in Gilead. So he would be the least likely person. But what happens? No one steps up over here in verse 18. No one fights the Ammonites. So the only option they have left is to go and call this guy there in verse 6. Or verse 5, the Ammonites came and made war. The elders of Gilead went to get Jepthah from the land of Tob. They said to him, "Come, be our commander, and let's fight the Ammonites." So he's probably the last person they want to give a call to, because, why would he answer their call? They disowned him. They drove him out of his home city because he was not a legitimate son. And Jepthah kind of gets onto him for that in verse 7. Jepthah replied to the elders, "Don't you hate me? And didn't you hate me and drive me out of my father's family? Why then have you come to me now when you're in trouble?" He's, pretty legit question. Why are you here now? And verse 8, they acknowledge that's true, but now we turn to you. Come with us, fight the Ammonites. You will become leader of all the inhabitants of Gilead. So their offer from back in verse 18 of chapter 10 is still the same. I mean, whoever will fight against the Ammonites will be our leader, even if it's you, Jepthah. I mean, yeah, what you say is true, but come help us. We're desperate. We have nowhere else to go. So Jepthah, verse 9, if you're bringing me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me, I will be your leader. They make a vow too, which vows are going to be pretty important in this chapter. They vow that the Lord is our witness if we don't do as you say in verse 10. So Jepthah went with the elders of Gilead. The people made him their leader and commander, and Jepthah repeated all his terms in the presence of the Lord at Mizpah. So the elders, the rulers at Gilead, make this vow with Jepthah. Kind of again, there was no we're talking about kind of the descent of judges as a whole. There's not really any call up of Jepthah by the Lord. This was, there was no one that was answering the call. God was not sending a judge. So what do? They go find this Jepthah, who's a kind of the head of this worthless rabble of men, and they know he's a valiant warrior. Like that wasn't, the issue before. He was just illegitimate. They were, you can understand the sons of Gilead. He was a threat to their. I mean, he was stronger than them probably. So if we can get rid of him, then we don't have to worry about our inheritance. Well, what's an inheritance when the Ammonites are coming in and taking over the place? You have nothing. So they kind of had to make this decision to call him back and ask him to be leader, because I mean, there was no one else doing it.
That's a great point, Alan. And I think that goes back to what we saw in chapter 10. Whenever they cried out to the Lord and he did not, he called them basically on their bluff, on their effort to manipulate God for good. What stands out to me is verse number 14 in chapter 10. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them deliver you wherever or whenever you are oppressed. God's saying, you've been seeking after these gods and you've been seeking to be like their people. Why don't you go live like they live for a little while? See how that works out for you. And instead of them maybe doubling down saying, no, they do that in verse 15. They do say, rescue us today. We'll get rid of the foreign gods. But whenever the rubber meets the road again and they have issues, they don't go to God in this instance. They go to a man, as you have mentioned, who is described as a valiant warrior. Obviously, his brothers are intimidated by him. They want his inheritance because they think that he'll just take everything because he can beat us all up and do whatever he wants to with us. They cast him out of Gilead, and he allows for his certain skill set to be what he lives by. He becomes a warlord. He becomes a leader of a militia, a leader of a group of renegades. He becomes a leader of a gang, basically. Therefore, whenever this issue continues to be seen where the Ammonites are fighting against Israel, they're thinking, well, who can lead us? Well, what about this guy who is already a strong fighter? Why don't we let him be the militia leader? And yet, I think we begin to see here who Jepthah really is. Jepthah is not only a valiant warrior, but his name also comes into play. His name means something along the lines of he opens or an open mouth. And I think we see that here in his character, the fact that he is at least within his mind, a very skillful negotiator. They come to him, they say, hey, would you be our commander? He says, as you mentioned, why would I do that? And what does he do? He ends up at the end of all this agreement. He goes from being simply a commander of an army, leading a military effort, to being the leader of all the inhabitants of Gilead. And they said, you will be our leader. And that begins Jepthah's then not God-given rise to leadership within Israel, but really they took him because he was known as a good fighter. And they wanted him to be their leader, him to try to get them out of this mess, which leads us to verse number 12, where Jepthah sends the messengers to the king of the Ammonites, asking, what have you done against me that you have come to fight in my land? And the king of the Ammonites said to Jepthah's messengers, when Israel came from Egypt, they seized my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok and the Jordan. Now restore it peacefully. And Jepthah again sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites to tell them, this is what Jepthah says. Israel did not take away the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites, but when they came from Israel, Israel traveled through the wilderness to the Red Sea and came to Kadesh. Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, please let us travel through your land. But the king of Edom would not listen. They also sent messengers to the king of Moab, but he refused. So Israel stayed in Kadesh. And then they traveled through the wilderness and around the lands of Edom and Moab, and they came to the east side of the land of Moab and camped on the other side of the Arnon, and did not enter into the territory of Moab, for the Arnon was the boundary of Moab. And then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, king of Heshbon. And Israel said to him, please let us travel through your land to our country. But Sihon would not trust Israel to pass through his territory. Instead, Sihon gathered all the troops and camped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. And then the Lord God of Israel handed over Sihon and all his troops to Israel, and they defeated him. So Israel took possession of the entire land of the Amorites who lived in that country. And they took possession of the territory of the Amorites from the Arnon to the Jabbok, and the wilderness to the Jordan. And the Lord God of Israel has now driven out the Amorites before his people. And will you force us out? He asked. Isn't it true that you can have whatever your God, Chemosh, conquers for you, and we can have whatever the Lord our God conquers for us? Now, are you any better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever contend with Israel or fight against them? While Israel lived 300 years in Heshbon and the Ar and their surrounding villages, and in all the cities on the banks of the Arnon, why didn't you take them back at that time? I have not sinned against you, but you are doing me wrong by fighting against me. Let the Lord, who is the judge, decide today between the Israelites and the Ammonites. But the king of the Ammonites would not listen to Jephthah's message that he sent. What Jephthah does here is he gives a proposed history lesson, we'll say, Alan, because the reality is the way Jephthah himself details what was the history between the Israelites and the people of Canaan wasn't exactly the way history played itself out. You, Alan, or somebody who really enjoys history, you do a great job of recalling very quickly how things happen within the Old Testament story. Where does Jephthah make mistakes throughout this retelling? What isn't exactly described here as it really was? That might help us to understand, again, the skillful negotiation that Jephthah tries to offer up here in order to get his way.
Well, you definitely see some mistakes on the part of the Ammonites. They are claiming this land all the way to the Jordan River, basically. And notice what happens when the Israelites got there after wandering through the wilderness. If you remember, they were told to not take the land, not go into the land of the Edomites, not go into the land of the Moabites, not to go into the land of the Ammonites, because those peoples had been given their inheritance, their land, by God. And so what they do is they go through the lands of the Amorites. Sihon is mentioned here, and he's an Amorite king. So and it's kind of funny too. Even though the Amorites are always listed as those ites that the Israelites had to wipe out in the land of Canaan, they actually asked permission to travel through his country, and they still were, if they would have just been kind to the Israelites, then maybe they could have not been part of that massive just destruction that Canaan was coming through. But Sihon fights with them. The Israelites defeat them, and now the Ammonites are claiming that Amorite land. So the Ammonites are claiming the old Amorite land.
Not confusing at all.
Not confusing at all. As their own. And Jepthah kind of reminds them, like, hey, that's not exactly true. Plus, I think he says it's been 300 years.
Yes.
Why are you just dealing with this now? I think verse 24 is kind of telling as to maybe Jepthah. I mean, clearly he has at least some knowledge of the history, and maybe the written history, the law, the books of the law, just by going through this history. But it's just interesting, isn't it true that you can have whatever your God Chemosh conquers for you, and we can have whatever the Lord our God conquers for us? Some people might view this as not putting Chemosh on the same level as God, just kind of almost mocking them. Well, let your God fight for your land, kind of like how in Gideon, let Baal contend for himself. That was more of a mocking, I think, kind of language. But here I kind of view this as just Jephthah's just the very immature understanding of God. Like, yes, they knew who God was and the history, and they sometimes they worshiped him, but I think even Jepthah and a lot of people of this day, they kind of just lumped God in with all the other gods,
right?
And that's why they were worshipped, so many of them. They were all pretty much the same, and they all had the same powers and stuff, and one conquered the other, one beat the other, depending. They were all just one big pantheon of gods. And this language here kind of sounds like that. He's just like,
Mhm.
well, let your God fight my God, and then we'll see who wins. And Balak tried this before, and uh, good luck. But he's not. Uh, this isn't the language of someone that views God as the only God and supreme above
Mhm.
all, and that Chemosh and all these other gods are non-existent. This is someone that sees them all about the same level here.
Right, and there's two places, at least it stand out to me, where Jephthah just gets things wrong.
Hmm.
Number one is here, where he brings up this god, Shemosh. That's not their god. Their god would have been Molech. This god here, Shemosh, he would have been the god of Moab, but their god would have been Molech. I think that gives more credence to what you're saying. Is that he is very paganistic in his understanding of the way the gods work, and he doesn't see this vast difference between gods. They're all just kind of lumped in together and the same. And then he shows, if your God is going to give you this, which again, wrong God, but the point still stands, then we'll just take what our God gives us. That's one mistake. But the second mistake, there's verse number 25.
Hmm.
Are you any better than Balak? Did he ever contend with Israel and fight against them? Yes, he did. He tried to, at least. Numbers 22 through 24 tells us that. We read that text in this study, that he did try to do so. So he's trying to frame things in a way, even though he wasn't successful at it, he's trying to frame things in such a way in order to really get not just the Ammonite king to understand things his way, but I also think he's trying to set God up to be on his side. Again, Jephtah is a very skillful negotiator, and he's treating God here, instead of treating God for who he is, the real omnipotent God who knows everything. He's trying to set him up kind of as a human judge to put more evidence before him, so that he might be on his side. Now, why would he do that? Well, he's doing that because he doesn't truly understand God. His theology is very, very bad. His understanding of God is very poor, which is what has really gotten us to this particular place where he's trying to have this negotiation. He's already negotiated one thing with the people of Gilead. Now he's trying to negotiate something else with the Ammonite king, and now he's trying to negotiate something with God himself, which we can see him do. We can see him trying to do this throughout this text, but we see that he's just really bad at it in regards to God. And maybe the most telling, before we get to the most well-known portion of Jephthah's story, is what happens in verse 28. That the king of the Ammonites will not listen to Jephthah's message. And actually, let me see, there's somebody else. Oh, I want actually, it's before that. It's before this, in verse number 11, that Jepthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him their leader and commander. And Jepthah repeated all his terms in the presence of the Lord at Mizpah. That's an issue. That's a problem. That shows his lack of understanding of the Torah and of the law, because this was not a place where he should have been giving any sort of sacrifices or having any sort of commune with God. It was an unauthorized location. We can go back to Deuteronomy 12, 5 through 14 to see that there were specific places where they were to have this sort of communication with God. That was not one of them. So they're misunderstanding God in a very serious fashion. Jephthah doesn't understand God. He doesn't respect God. He doesn't give God the proper reverence that is due him in almost every respect. And that's seen not just on what he does previously, but what he's going to try to do now, I think, in trying to set up God, almost bribe God in a sense, in order to achieve something great within his efforts here as this leader and commander of the people of Gilead. Alan, why don't you get into that next section there, beginning in verse 29, and talk about this vow, which is going to lead to the sacrifice that takes place at the end.
You mentioned the word bribe, and I think that's a key understanding of how these people viewed God or the gods. They saw them as, if I sacrifice to this God, if I offer him this food, this whatever they could offer to the gods,
Even sometimes
then
people, and that's going
yeah,
to play a part here.
then we will bribe. They are bribing. They were, causing the gods would have to support them or give them victory or something. And I think that's the mindset here, especially with Jephthah's vow.
Absolutely.
He's bribing God. That was common with all of them, not understanding that God doesn't, has God a great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? He just wanted obedience.
Mhm.
And even then, just because you obey, that doesn't mean he's going to grant you victory. But it's definitely bringing God much lower down, not just
Mhm.
doing God's will and praying for his mercy, kind of thing, like we should. It's okay, if I just sacrifice enough, or if I just make this vow, then he'll have to support me. I mean, because I did what I needed to do for him, and not just falling at his feet and humility before God. So that was the mindset of,
Mhm.
I think, the Israelites here toward Yahweh God, and even just pagans as a whole toward their gods. That's how they viewed them, which makes sense, because I mean they were able to create these gods and visualize. They made their gods, so it would make sense that they would be able to control them in a way. That's what idolatry was they can make these images, they can make these golden calves, and it's a way to control. Even though they said that these gods were powerful and had all this ability more than but they were in a way trying to control these gods, and trying to control the one true God, which how can he be controlled? He's the creator of the world. So that kind of gives it inkling into the mindset here of the people at the time. So then that gives, and to say this, look at verse 29, the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephtha. Well, that seems way, I mean, all we've talked about Jephtha, there's not much good.
Even
So
in all of
why?
this, even in all this bad stuff, here the Lord, it just shows how much he wants what's best for his people.
And just because the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephtha, that is not a statement of God approved of everything that's gone up to this point, and God will approve of everything that comes after this point.
Mhm.
No, he just happens to. I think this is a reminder that even this mighty man Jephtha, uh, he can't have victory without the support of God,
Right.
and that is not just because God gave them victory doesn't mean that he is pleased with every single thing that they've done. It's God can do what he wants. He can give people victory. He'll later on give the Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians victory. I mean, a wicked nation, a wicked king, victory over his people. Is that a statement of support to Nebuchadnezzar and everything that he believed and did? Absolutely not. He gives the Assyrians victory over the northern nation of Israel. For whatever reason, God gives victory or defeat. That's up to him. That has nothing to do with the people at the time. That's just whatever God wanted to do. So he wanted to give Jephtha. He needed to give Jephtha this support, because even as mighty as Jephtha was, he would not have won without God. So that's just this little statement, I think, reminds us that even with them leaving God out, God is still in control of this whole situation. But he's not going to, he's not just gonna, we're not gonna see in the text like, okay, I agree with what you said here, you messed up here, I don't agree with that. I mean, really the whole Bible's like that. We have countless stories of the patriarchs and all these great men, and then they do something wrong, and then it doesn't say whether it was wrong or not. We just kind of read in between the lines, because we know what God says about lying or cheating on your, having multiple wives or whatever. It never really says that, God approved of that, but obviously we know what he approves of or not. So we can kind of surmise that, okay, he wasn't happy with that, but the story continues. They were still,
Mhm.
and in same in, like, we keep referencing Hebrews and all these guys that show up that you're like, what are they doing there in Hebrews? Because we know so many bad things they did. Well, again, that's not a statement of they were perfect. It's just a statement of they had faith, and they were able to accomplish great things because of that faith. And here's Jephtha; he's going to accomplish a victory for the people of Israel because of the faith that he did have. Whatever measure of that was or not, if it was a lot or a little, there was some. So he's remembered for that. But again, obviously, a lot of that is pointing toward, I guess, what we view as is happening in these next few verses, but I think that helps us to understand maybe why we come to the conclusions that we do.
Yeah, right. This section of Jephthah's story here in Judges 11, as you mentioned earlier, is very, very controversial. People are not exactly sure how to understand and interpret what's mentioned here in the text. I think there is a a surface reading that lends itself to a particular understanding and interpretation. Yet that surface reading is it makes us very uncomfortable. It makes us very uncomfortable, and it makes us question, particularly what you just mentioned. How could someone who supposedly did what we're about to mention, how was he found in Hebrews? How could he be mentioned as a person of faith? How is it that God could be mentioned at all in this particular situation? And yet, I think that kind of G rating of this text, the whitewashing of the text, to take the really grotesque nature of the text out of the text, I don't think that is something that's needed. I think we need to be able to read the text exactly how the text reads. And I think that the way we've gone through Judges and shown this to be a downward spiral, a very fatal digression within the moral and the religious compass of Israel, it shows us that this is really where we should expect Israel to be involved in something such as this. And we've beat around the bush and alluded to it. If you're not familiar with what we're talking about what you see beginning verse 30, that Jepthah made a vow to the Lord that if you in fact hand over the Ammonites to me, whoever comes out of the door of my house to greet me when I return safely from the Ammonites will belong to the Lord, and I will offer that person as a burnt offering. Jepthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord handed them over to him. He defeated 20 of their cities with a great slaughter from Aroer all the way to the entrance of Minnith and to the Abel Kermim, so that the Ammonites were subdued before the Israelites. And when Jepthah came to his home in Mizpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him with tambourines and dancing. She was his only child, and he had no other son or daughter besides her. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "No, not my daughter. You have devastated me. You have brought great misery on me. I have given my word to the Lord and cannot take it back." And then she said to him, "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you have said, for the Lord brought vengeance on your enemies, the Ammonites." And she also said to her father, "Let me do this one thing. Let me wander 2 months through the mountains with my friends and mourn my virginity." "Go," he said, and he sent her away 2 months. She left with her friends and mourned her virginity. And as she wandered through the mountains, at the end of the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he kept the vow he had made about her, and she had never been intimate with a man. Now it became a custom in Israel that for 4 days each year, the young women of Israel would commemorate the daughter of Jepthah the Gileadite. The horrible incident we're talking about here is the very rash vow that is made by Jepthah within this text, and the reality that the text tells us that he kept that vow. Now, of course, Alan, the different interpretations are that it was exactly what it says, a burnt offering, which that particular word in Hebrew is, I listening to a friend who is a Hebrew scholar in a very real sense, who knows Hebrew and knows the background of these words. It doesn't mean anything else other than what it says. It is a Hebrew word for burnt offering. And for him to say then that he kept his vow would very much mean that he offered a human sacrifice to the Lord. Now, saying that, Alan, that's what makes people uncomfortable. Why would the Lord allow for Jepthah to do such a thing? And I think what you have said already up to this point helps us understand that this isn't something that the Lord wanted. There are a number of things within this text that are done that the Lord did not want, yet they were done really as a fulfillment of the reality of chapter 10 of verses 6 through 16, that the people had become pagan Canaanites in a very real sense. They did not know the law. They did not know the God, and they did not know the Lord as they ought to have known him. and it led them to do some really awful, terrible things. Here, Jephtha is thinking that he can bribe the Lord in order to gain a victory, and yet this isn't not that's just not how you treat God. Everything from the jump, once we get to verse 30, that's not how God would have it to be. Well, what additional insight do you have here in this text, Alan, that can help us to understand exactly how this is being carried out, and to not rationalize? I'm not trying to rationalize this. We're just trying to understand it. How can this be the case?
There's certain little bits of language here that you can understand. I mean, I can definitely understand. Uh, it's not super 100% clear. So I can understand, some of the language and some people that will, like you said, whitewash it a little bit and come to the conclusion that maybe this wasn't a human sacrifice all the way, but this was maybe a dedication to the Lord or something. So she was not killed, but she could never marry or have children, and that does that does fit a little bit with the context we mentioned earlier, from Gideon and through some of these minor judges. There's kind of a chiastic structure that centers on Jephtha, and that structure focuses on the number of children that they had, starting with Gideon having 70, and then
Tola and
Tola, Jared. Tola is not mentioned about any children, so 0, or not 0, but he's just not mentioned. But then Jair is mentioned of having 40. Okay. Well, now we get to Jephtha, who
30.
One way or the other, he had no heirs. He was, even if you believe that he didn't kill his daughter, but she was just dedicated to the Lord, well, she still doesn't, technically she's not his heir anymore. She's dedicated to the Lord. She never has any children herself to pass that on. So he was left without a dynasty, basically, which in the context of these from Gideon onward, that kingly dynastic rule of these judges is a theme that kind of continues. The idea of, establishing yourself not as just a savior judge of Israel, but as a king, and setting your sons up on all the thrones, and setting your sons up in rulers over cities, and having a huge amount of sons. That's the thing that kings did. So that theme is going through this section. So you had Gideon had 70, Tola had 0, Jair had 40 children, Jephtha had none, basically. And then on the backside, we'll talk later, you have Ibzan, Elon, Abdon. And Ibzan, it goes in reverse. Ibzan has 40, Elon is not mentioned, and then Abdon, between his, I think, 30 sons and 40 grandsons, had a 70 again. So you have this reversal of the order. Again, just focusing on the fact that, whenever you have that chiastic structure, the one in the middle is kind of the focus of that organization. So you do see that focus, the fact that Jephtha cannot have a dynasty, cannot be a king in that same way that some of the others tried to be, as a focus. So then, with that in mind, you can say, well, whether she's killed in a sacrifice or she just never has children, it fits that structure. So it's things like that you can lean toward the more, the G-rated version. But again, like you said, the use of burnt offering is never used for just offering your son, like
The dedication.
dedicating. I can't think about Hannah dedicating Samuel to the Lord. That's the language is not the same there. And even just verse 31, the CSB says whoever. I think some other versions say whatever, but really this word is either vague as to, it's not specifically what. It's at the very least it's vague, and at the most it actually is who. So he's thinking with the language like this, he's not thinking about sacrificing his daughter per se, but I think he's already thinking about a human sacrifice, assuming it will be a slave or servant, or maybe even one of his wives. I'm sure he probably had multiple ones. Um, which, think about it, comes out the doors to greet me. Well, they didn't really have dogs and cats and pets. They just had like farm animals. A cow's not going to come out and say, "Oh, there's my master, moo," and come out and greet him. That's just not what animals did. That's not the language you use here. I mean, you're talking about a person in
And even
this.
adding on top of that, Alan, he's talking about this in a militaristic, from a militaristic standpoint. What was the practice whenever you had a great victory and you came home? Well, what was expected? Well, it was expected for people to come out. Normally, it would be women and children, because they're the ones that have been left at home, come out celebrating, go back to the Red Sea, the crossing of the Red Sea. What happened after that? Well, Miriam and the women were dancing and singing to the Lord. Whenever David came back after his victories, who met him coming into the city gates? It was women and children singing about his great victories. He was setting himself up for that very thing.
Yep.
But that leads to this question: why? Why would he think this way? Who are the Canaanite gods specifically mentioned in this text, Alan? There would be Chemosh is one of the ones that's been mentioned, and then the one that he should have said that he, for whatever reason, just got it mixed up and didn't mention, Molech. What are they known for? They're literally known for child sacrifices and human sacrifices, which is something that God specifically said that they needed to watch out for, because that's what need to watch out for as they went into the land of Canaan. I think it's Deuteronomy 12. I think it is Deuteronomy 12. I think I have it written down. Yeah, Deuteronomy 12, 29 through 32 specifically mentions to watch out for the paganism of the land, because you will end up offering your own people as sacrifices. That's
So this is
exactly what takes place here. Yet, Alan, was there a way that this still could have been avoided?
that's the sad part, is if he had really known the law, there are stipulations for getting out of a vow. I mean, vows were serious, much more than we consider vows, but I mean, they were very serious. I mean, even just we think of really the only vows we take are legal vows, like, a marriage or maybe some sort of business vow that, you can get sued for if you break the contract, more like contracts. So they were very serious, but there were stipulations in the law for just, I guess, if you take a rash vow just for getting out of it. It's as simple as, I think it's just a simple sacrifice. If I remember right, you go sacrifice a lamb or something and you're good. Like that was all that
even
needed
money,
to be done.
even something more simple.
Yeah, give some money. I mean,
money.
It was not a difficult thing to go back on a vow, even something like this. So
Leviticus 27, 1 through 8 specifically talks about how you can rectify a vow that you needed to break.
Yeah.
They had it there. But whenever you don't know the law, you're not able to take advantage of the law. It just adds on another layer of the sad nature of this text.
And really, like we said, looking at the context of Judges, I admit, in times past, I was one that kind of said, well, maybe, the language isn't 100% clear. So maybe, if maybe it wasn't a full human sacrifice, maybe it was something else. But I mean, I've been in that camp before too, but I mean, as we've read Judges and just the decline and the misunderstanding of who God is, and just the influence of the nations around them at this point in the book, it really fits with, I mean, how they are. I mean, think ahead to the end of the book of Judges, we're going to see them, I mean, raping and chopping up people, and so it makes sense that something like this is along that path, because and it mentioned, I think he mentioned, this was about 300 years since the Israelites had been in the land. So even though we're only in Judges chapter 10, and all that stuff that happens later on is like Judges chapter 21, this is very far. We don't know, what order these judges came in. Jepthah, there's not really any sort of timestamp to go with any of the others. Like obviously Shamgar came before Deborah, because Deborah mentions Shamgar in her song, so we know which one came first. But Jepthah, there's not really any other any of the other stories that overlap. So this could have happened, could have happened at any point in the Judges, but because of that 300 years, we know that's probably toward the end of the Judges period, which if they're getting worse and worse throughout that whole period, then Israelites offering human sacrifices, that pretty much fits with with the time frame. This isn't like it's one generation after Joshua or something. And actually, I think you do get a timestamp with some of those things that happen at the end of the book, and it seems like those are actually earlier in the time period of Judges and not 300 years into the time period of Judges. So again, just to say this, if I think it's okay to see this for what it is. I think that's what happened. I think there was a human sacrifice. I don't think the Lord, approved of that. And it obviously never says that. It never says that the
In
Lord
fact,
was.
think about this, Alan, that often whenever there's some sort of vow made to God, God would give some sort of let it be. Sure,
Yeah.
let's go with it. He never says anything here. After he says, I will offer that person as a burnt offering, the Lord doesn't say anything. That I think that passivity from God ought to tell you that this was not something he was okay with. But go back again to chapter 10, where the Lord says, go and cry out to the gods you have chosen, let them deliver you whenever you are oppressed. You want to try this way? I'm going to let you try this way. And let's see where it gets you, Jephtha. Go ahead. If you think this is the right thing to do, go ahead and do that. Which whenever it turns sour, what does Jephtha want to do? Does Jephtha want to repent and say, oh no, I've really messed up? But what does he do? He blames his daughter. You have devastated me. You're the person that's brought this great misery on me. He doesn't take advantage of the law because he doesn't know the law. And at the end of it all, as you mentioned earlier, which I think is a really good point to bring up, Jephtha is judged by God in the fact that he's childless.
Mm-hmm.
He has no one to carry on his lineage, and that was a great point of shame within this text. And there one more thing, Alan, I want to bring up, and then I'll let you close this out. There's a great I don't know what's the opposite of parallel, a great reversal in this story from what we see back in Genesis 22. Philip Martin brought up in his study on this what is found in Daniel Block's commentary on the Judges. You could take the Genesis 22 account of Abraham with Isaac, match it up perfectly almost with Jephthah's account, and it is almost a complete reversal. All the great and good that was done in Genesis 22 is completely the opposite here in Judges 11. All the righteousness, the godly behavior, the faith, the trust that's seen in Genesis 2, all of it is absolutely absent here in Judges chapter 11, which I don't want to say that's just coincidental, but that might just show, and I think it does show, how far the people of God had fallen from what God expected them to be, following in the steps of faithful Abraham. This right here, Judges 11, in this particular section, 29 through the end of the chapter, shows just how much the Jews had become Canaanite pagans. And it's really sad. And I, as much as we wish that maybe that we wish this wasn't the case, I think it's just a reality to show what happens whenever you reject God and you seek after the people of the land. Alan, close us out this afternoon.
One thing I'm starting with Gideon and pretty much the rest of the judges, even though the Lord brings them victory, Gideon defeats the Midianites, Jephthah defeats the Ammonites. Later on, we'll see Samson having great victories over the Philistines. Even though he brought them victory, because of their wickedness, because of all the things that they do, they don't end with peace. It's always kind of sorrow or something bad happening at the end. Gideon, they have this idol in their house, and what happens? His son ends up killing all of his other brothers. And Abimelech comes up. That's not a great ending to that story. And then even Abimelech, he has some victory, and then he gets killed by a woman, throwing a millstone out. So, and here Jephtha, he has this victory, but it comes with a cost and a punishment too. So usually, if you're obviously not no one's 100% righteous, but if you're more of a righteous figure, the Lord will give you victory, and then that's it. There's peace after that. David had that a lot, or some of the kings we see that, or some of the early patriarchs. I mean, yeah, they had. I mean, obviously, we read about some negative things that happened and their consequences, but usually they ended up their life in a relative peace. Well, you don't really see that with at least these three major judges here: Gideon, Jepthah, and of course Samson later on getting killed at the end of his story. So again, just to say this what we've talked about happening, that probably did happen, that this was a human sacrifice. I think that's appropriate viewpoint to have. I think it's okay to believe that that's what happened. I don't think that diminishes the text or diminishes God in any way. It just shows the depravity of the situation at the time.
I would agree with that. To say that this is what God wanted, I don't think would be appropriate or accurate. This is showing how far they had fallen from where God wanted them to be. They wanted to seek out these other gods, and whenever they were pressed, they they reach out to God in a very empty fashion just to try to get to a better place. And God says, no, this is where you want to be. If you want to play in this sandbox, play in this sandbox for a while and see, and you'll see just how bad things can get without me, which is exactly what we see here, I believe, what happens in Jephthah's life. Yet Jephthah's story is not done. We're going to pick up on Friday in chapter 12 and look at the end of his life, and then look at three of the little minor judges that are mentioned very quickly, and set ourselves up for our studies in Samson next week. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is a tough text. As we mentioned, it is a contested, controversial text. But I hope that you've seen that our viewpoints, I think, are supported best by what we find here within this text, and how it really does, unfortunately, fit the flow of what we see within Judges. That the people of God are becoming more like Canaanite pagans, and they're going to continue to suffer as they move in that direction, and that's going to culminate in the horrible chapters that we see at the end of the Judges. We're almost there, not there yet, but we appreciate you being with us up until this point. Hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. And if you're looking for a group of people to study with tomorrow night, please feel free to join us at the Pleasant Plains Church of Christ, 384 Pleasant Plains Road in Jackson, Tennessee at 7 p.m. tomorrow. We'll be in person studying together from the book of Ecclesiastes. Or if you can't join us in person, please feel free to join us online on Facebook or YouTube for that study. If you have any questions, please let us know. Thank you for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your day. God bless. And we'll see you next time as we continue our walk through history, the story of God's word found within the Bible. Thank you all so much. Take care.